already live.
All right. Hello. Hello, this is the class. I'll get there. This is Bella Robinson, who will be speaking to us today. She is a libertarian and sex worker rights activist. She's worked in the sex industry for over 30 years. She is currently the executive director of the Rhode Island chapter of Coyoteri, which stands for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, which is and you've been executive director in Rhode Island since 2009. And thank you very much for coming out here today.
Thanks for having me. About my history, as I was just saying, I've been a sex worker for over 30 years. Anyone that had indiscriminate sex could be charged with prostitution. They didn't need any proof. But being that it was a felony, the woman stayed in jail for 6 months and the courts got boggled down. Margot St. James, who was the founder of Coyoteri, for about 30 years. It was around 2002, one of the Providence. It wasn't illegal, and the judge threw it all out. So there went down 31 to 39% straight across the board. There was 800 narrative arised. And the trafficking narrative is much like and you know, ask yourselves why this was only focused on white women. And actually the writer was dating a white prostitute later. So as we move along, the trafficking I think we can all agree that, you know, minors don't belong in the sex trade. And research out of New York from the Urban Justice Institute, they interviewed just under 300 people, and there's also a bigger study where they interviewed 1,000 minors or youths in 6 different cities. The youths report that they cannot get the state to provide them shelter or any other vital service. And the police and social workers. So we have all these safe harbor laws and that they were victims. And I'm seeing your 17-year-old friend and now you're the perpetrator or not. Rhode Island contest to 15 years, so I can't imagine what they threatened him with, because his real crime was his girlfriend was an underage escort. Sex workers need to be able to work together to stay safe. Many of them share space, massage parlors, they screen clients together. More often than not, they work for the sex worker. The only choice sex workers really had were strip clubs, massage parlors, working for escort agencies out of the yellow pages that took about half your wages, or street prostitution. So the internet has choose what type of work in their own scenario. I also want to point out that there's a lot of sex workers that are more empowered than me and less empowered than me. For public health and safety. New York was spending $7 million. So after 5 years of this debate, the police were like, okay, we're not going to do it anymore. You're right, we're going to stop doing it unless we think of pimp back over everyone. If an escort has someone drive her to an appointment, they can be arrested for pandering or promoting. So back to the youth. 5 years ago, I kind of thought, you know, I was an incorrigible. So part of me felt like we should lock up all these teens because they're ungovernable. Where these kids come from, and a lot of them don't have safe places to go. They don't. Provide you with a bed in a foster care. I had no clue they could just shut the door of a shelter and say, sorry, we're full, and leave a 15-year-old on the street. It's free trauma counseling to children that have been sexually abused, and interactions with them over the last couple of years. And they were advocating to train male men to. They already admitted that they didn't have any beds for adult victims. They don't have any housing. They don't have jobs that pay a fair wage, a living wage. They don't have a higher education without debt. So basically, they have nothing to rescue people from. Calling a residential brothel. And what do you think they're going to look like? Do you think they're going to? I showed you pictures of girls in cages with white girls with black hands on their faces. And I'm not saying that trafficking does not occur. Trafficking happens in every labor sector. But the trafficking victims I've spoken to allowed them to be trafficked. Now, let's think about this. When you're a victim of mugging, rape, domestic violence, you got mugged, you're a victim. And in my view, they want to report it. Do they need services? How can we support you? How can we be a service to you? That's what you do with the victim. What we see with the trafficking narrative is they put a little blue dress on a victim and she tells her a sad story, which a lot of times are very traumatic and sad. And as soon as the victims have very little say. And now we get to the point where they're classifying all prostitution as victims, prostitutes as victims or sex workers. But at the same time, they're trying to victims. Now, if you notice, it's really hard to get the sex that do research are still, if they disclose that they used to be a sex worker, they're still ignored. So when I think about how we can frame solutions, well, let's go and do this. It's a great campaign. Who doesn't want to save kids? But when I looked a little a year, 233 million stays in the United States. Students that went to Brown for 2 weeks to take a trafficking class because it's going to look really good on their college resume. It's the trafficking engine since the 2009 recession. Everyone wants to go to school. There's tons of They told her she needed to go take this class, form an NGO, and create. So let's say that was to tick me off a little bit. Campus, I want you to just walk up to strangers and say, tell me everything about trafficking, and come back and tell me what they say. Only one person didn't know about trafficking. Almost everyone thought it only had to do with sex, and only one person had any clue about any other labor abuse in the whole wide world. So I proved to the students in one morning, the Indians in the rainforest know about sex trafficking. What are we going to do? For $50 or $100 or $200, and people really wouldn't blame them. They're like, well, they're poor, and we understand they're poor. Entering into the sex industry, no one seems to be able to connect this. Prostitutes and all this, and I'm going to tell you what they are. In Rhode Island, we have a 211 number. I don't know what number you guys dial in, but it's a number you just dial 211, and they'll give you a list of any mental health, any for an example, I'm an empowered sex worker that has a nice apartment, so if I were to be rescued, that would mean living in a public shelter, getting a job at Walmart that would never cover my rent, beaten up or fleeing some kind of violence, it might be an option, or lift. So a couple years ago, I took a online trafficking, that wanted to go on ride-alongs to be first responders at the massage raids. And I said, respond with what? You don't even have a blanket. For the sex workers and the clients, they went from 25 to 2%. They went all the way down to 2% of minors in the sex trade within a decade. There was that much of a reduction. So I want to talk about when a sex worker can't call the police and report crimes. They don't just necessarily abuse sex workers. Sometimes that spills off. And it's their fault. And next thing you know, a nice lady's being. So I want to tell you a story about Heather. Heather's from West Virginia. And he asked her if they were alone. She thought her friend was outside. And as soon as she said, yeah, we're alone, come on in, he stuck a gun in her prison for a long time anyway. So she said she knew he had done it before. She knew he was going to kill her. And she was reaching for a rake to try to fight him off. And he put the gun down to grab her hand for the rake, and she picked it. Screaming, and the neighbors called the police. And the police got there. They opened the trunk of his car, and he had a kill kit. He had garbage bags. He had so another thing that happens under bad cops immunity to rape, rob, exploit, and murder prostitutes. Or two women come forward, no one's going to believe you, but you know when it doesn't come forward. But with cameras and different things, we're seeing things come to light that have been going. Now let's add into a little factor of migration. Okay, immigrants are they won't leave, and I go, oh honey, they don't have to take their passport. All they got to I say because you don't want to go back. So I want to point out a few things that are in the Trafficking of Persons report, the protocol that we use and that we're trying to sell globally. It actually says that if an immigrant, illegal immigrant, is arrested for prostitution or in a raid, she's not even arrested at this point, she's immediately told, if you will not say you're a victim, you're being deported right now. You know, whether they're forced or not, they have to say that the boyfriend, the brothel manager, someone. What they do then is they lock these women down in shelters for 2 their family. They basically go to work one day and they don't come home. We're allowed to let 500 of these most extreme trafficking cases stay in the United States a year, and we deport 2/3 of these women after they go through this ordeal anyway. So from my understanding, a lot of them are saying, just deport me, I don't want to play the game because I don't want to be detained for 2 or 3 years and be deported anyway. So this idea of and they want to just rationalize out of their hysteria to keep people out of their countries. So you have women that are being very vulnerable, and I shouldn't just say women, there's sex workers that are and to attack their clients like they're doing the women's clients. Can be victims too, and she wasn't real interested in men being victims. So criminalization's not
We covered the Nordic model yet.
Oh, you haven't? Okay.
Exactly.
Well, the Nordic model, they're going to create all these services, but they never tend to appear. And they start to target the clients. Well, there was a woman, when was this? About probably 2010. The social worker was concerned that she wasn't ashamed. She used to do sex work, even though it was legal, that they gave charges. And she fought for 4 years to get visitation. And she said, she promised, she says, I'm going to make sure this never happens to another sex worker. So she finally got a supervised visit with the social worker and the ex and the children, and guess what happened? He stabbed her to death and murdered her in front of She had labor rights. They took her children because she wasn't ashamed of herself. Model is they like to, I watched a documentary when they can hear the escort talking on the phone, and they're like, oh, maybe she's talking to the pimp or the traffickers, or maybe it's just her family. And then they watch the man, come into the apartment building, go into her apartment, and they wait till he leaves an hour. And now think about it, if she was a trafficking victim, well, they just let someone assault her, take you to jail, but if you just admit what happened, we'll write you a summons to go to court. Now, needless to say, they don't seem to care if he goes, what was going on out in the hallway. But no one seems to care if she's murdered over this or if her landlord finds out or she's a victim. So let's pretend we have a magic wand, and I'm going to wave the magic wand and end the demand. One client left. Why is it no one cares that these women have no money then? You've taken away the only income they have, and you've not replaced. You've not done anything to lift people out of poverty. Unfortunately, we find out that in the demand doesn't work. What in the demand does, it might scare off some of the good clients that are respectable guys that will screen and tell you where they work, that have nice jobs, that treat you well, and it leaves the riff-raffy guys. Sex workers have to take on more clients, shadier clients. It just makes everything more. I like. There's a great book called Taking the Crime Out of Sex Work, New Zealand. The Prostitution Reform Act that were on those committees in New Zealand. And what New Zealand did is they brought healthcare purpose, that their primary purpose was the health and safety of the sex. I didn't want to hear about condoms being on the sidewalk, the health and safety. So they decriminalized adult prostitution in 2002 or 3. And some great things have happened since then. Sex workers report they have better relationships with police, which is I think $25,000. A street-based worker called the cops and said the client wouldn't pay her $100 he owed her, and they said, well, son, you're going to go to the ATM and take out $100, or you're going to go to jail for theft. And the judge says, you got sex through fraud, which is rape. I think these are good messages to society, that society is not going to. As far as stigma, I have a 24-year-old daughter, and when I tell her that 30 years ago, no one would stand up for gay people, and you could beat up a gay person. To get decriminalized. They needed hate crime legislation, they needed discrimination legislation, and even then it took a couple more decades to change social perception. And now it's not okay to publicly hate on gays, because you'll be called out for it. So if you're a gay hater, you got to do it in private. Like the abortion thing, there's always going to be a tug of war. But a look at, when we talk about human trafficking nowadays, everyone wants to focus on sex, and everyone wants to kind of know about women out on the strawberry fields out in California that was a white van kind of chasing them, and they ran up to a police cruiser thinking they would get help. And the white van talked to the cop, and the cop put him in the cruiser and drove him back to the farm and told him, you have to stay here because that's what your visa says. They weren't even going to investigate their complaint. were in the facility they gave them to live in. This but if I think minimum wage is not okay. They deserve a living wage too. They shouldn't have to live in a hut without. So a lot of these labor things were abused. I read a report about a year ago. It was the biggest healthcare report, the healthcare effects on. And the few sex workers that said that they were forced into prostitution were faced with less abuse than every other labor sector. And I have a couple hunches why. I can beat you up in a strawberry field and you can still pick strawberries. Force you into sex work and advertise you as this pretty girl online when you're all beaten up and traumatized. A lot of these people in other sectors are still raped and sexually abused or beaten. So this narrative that this only happens in the sex industry to the Middle East to be domestic servants. And it takes like 3 months. Especially if they're a predator or an abuser over you. Over the last decade, we've reframed prostitution with sex trafficking. In Rhode Island, stings, and the ACLU called them out and were like, let's face it, these aren't human trafficking, these are prostitution stings. These are based on embarrassing people, terrorizing the erotic community, because I really don't believe they can effectively is anyone familiar with the legislation around Backpage the last couple of years, or what Backpage is?
We haven't talked about it, but
and there's been several lawsuits against them. And I read an article in 2012 where 50 attorneys the police will say she offered sex for it. No, she didn't. For an hourly rate, but the police still have to prove that you agreed to have. There's people to prove this in a court of law. So recently, I'm reading articles now in South Carolina that a woman was at a hotel. She was only doing out calls with another. Approval. So to be an ally, you don't have to approve of it. You're not promoting us. You're just saying that you understand that we have human rights and we deserve human rights. I was going to mention too that if any of you are ever doing projects in the future and need data or want to ask questions, I'm on Facebook as Bella Robinson, or you can email me at bella@coyote if there's nothing in the title, I'll delete you. But if you're ever doing a you're like, no, this can't be true. But it really, really is. It really, really is. Email, yes, Bella. TERI.org. As a matter of fact, we can do that too. I do a lot of projects with Brown students, well, students from everywhere, and I just got a lot of good data, and I'm really grateful that you in the future. I do want to make sure we can pass some this way, and we'll pass some this way. So much data. She does. Let's get the data straight, because think about if it's, what other framework do we have to lie about something to get attention, right? If kids were starving and I raised money and didn't send food, I'd go to jail for fraud. Maybe I can raise money to create awareness that kids, right? But that's the same thing they're doing about trafficking. There's no solution. It's not help the people. It's just create hysteria and workers. So, hey, thanks for having me, everyone.
Thank you for coming here.